When one door no longer opens, people choose to build another path. That is exactly what is happening with grain importing countries in the Middle East. They no longer wait for shipments from the US. A whole region that once relied on American grain is now turning to new names. Ports that used to receive goods from Kansas or Nebraska are now replaced with containers labeled Canada Wheat Board. Canada showed up just in time, seizing billion-dollar contracts from the hands of the US. And what about the US silos remain full? Farmers are still waiting, and the price of bread you see today at Walmart has doubled. Watch the video. The collapse of American agriculture. Canada floods the Middle East with barley and wheat to learn which 5 Middle Eastern countries have chosen Canadian grain over US grain. Saudi Arabia. In the American Midwest, wheat was once likened to soft gold. It wasn't just an agricultural product. It was an economic foundation, a point of pride for millions of families living on the fields of Kansas, Oklahoma, and North Dakota. For many farmers, each harvest carried not only hopes for a livelihood, but also an invisible bond with the world, especially with countries that once saw the US as an irreplaceable food reserve. Saudi Arabia was one of them. For over 2 decades, this oil-rich kingdom was one of the most loyal customers of American grain. In Riyadh, morning pita bread was made from Kansas hard wheat, and in Jeddah, import companies considered American grain the default choice, due to its quality, price, and shipping reliability. From 2010 to 2020, at certain points, over 75% of Saudi wheat imports came from the US ships, leaving Houston ports carried not just goods, but trust that the US would always be there when the world needed it. But by 2025, that was no longer true. According to USDA data from June 2025, Saudi Arabia imported around 3.569 million tons of wheat, a 14% drop from the previous year. More importantly, the US was no longer the main supplier. Canadian grain supplies are rising quickly, and many new contracts have been signed with provinces like Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Food distributors in Saudi say that while the US may be cheaper, Canada makes them feel more secure. According to reports from TradeMap and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, in just the first quarter of 2025, Canada secured over $420 million in wheat and barley export contracts to Saudi Arabia, most of which used to belong to the US. This quiet reversal is leaving a heavy toll on American farmers, especially in wheat export-dependent states like Kansas, Oklahoma, and North Dakota. These were once golden wheat lands producing millions of tons annually, most of which were exported, particularly to the Middle East. When the Saudi market, one of the most stable buyers, backed out without warning, farmers here felt like the ground fell beneath them. Preliminary USDA estimates suggest that just in the 2024-25 export season alone, the US may lose around $260–300 million solely from the loss of market share in Saudi Arabia. With no buyers, domestic wheat prices plunge, yet input costs don't fall: fertilizers, machinery, seasonal labor. Everything has gone up. As a result, many households have had to scale back cultivation, even leave part of their land idle because planting means more losses. In Kansas, unharvested fields are starting to appear. Harvesters sit idle in barns because there's no money for fuel. Grain silos are full, but no one is buying. Some small cooperatives have had to shut down due to being unable to repay their loans. With Saudi gone, the dominoes begin to fall. Exporters struggle, farmers can't sell, and entire farming towns that lived off the harvest are affected. Equipment shops, gas stations, repair garages all begin reducing their operating hours. The impact doesn't stop at the fields. When goods stop leaving ports, dock workers lose jobs. When shipping contracts dry up, transport companies cancel agreements. A flour mill near Houston port had to temporarily close due to a lack of international orders, something that hadn't happened in over 15 years. And as tax revenue from agriculture drops, even small rural schools feel the pain. The principal of an elementary school in western Oklahoma said that this year they had to cut extracurricular programs due to reduced funding. From the other side of the world, Saudi consumers may not know what's happening in Kansas. They only see Canadian bread on the shelf. Clean, punctual, easy to store. Containers of wheat from Manitoba arriving at Damham Port go straight into national reserves. The image once belonging to American grain now carries the red maple leaf logo. Without any major media campaign, Canada only needed to be on time, meet quality standards, and, more importantly, come with no political risk. For Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, that's enough. And for Americans, the heartbreak isn't just losing a contract. It's losing faith in a system that had run smoothly for decades. If even a long-standing ally like Saudi no longer trusts American grain, who else will? When stability is no longer tied to the name America, but to a flag bearing a red maple leaf. The situation becomes even more alarming when Saudi Arabia is just the beginning. Many in the industry predict that the UAE, Qatar, and even Egypt are reconsidering their import strategies. Once these countries collectively shift to Canada, the US will not only lose market share, but also its leadership role in the global food supply chain. At that point, the golden fields of the American Midwest will no longer be export icons, but quiet reminders of a once glorious past. And for now, amid the silence of idle warehouses and farming towns slowly shrinking bit by bit, one question remains unanswered if even your closest market has turned away. What does America have left? Egypt! In Egypt, a loaf of bread is not merely a part of a meal. It is the pulse of daily life for nearly 70 million people who rely on subsidized food policies. A flat, thin, and simple loaf, yet it carries political, social, and economic weight that few would expect. Just a few cents increase in flour prices can trigger a chain reaction, plunging an entire bustling street in Cairo into rage. In the past, during economic hardships, Egypt turned to the United States, trusting in a stable, high-quality wheat supply and a readiness to help. But now Canada, a faraway country across the Atlantic, is seizing contracts that once belonged exclusively to America. In the first half of 2025, Egypt harvested only about 3.9 million tons of domestic wheat, lower than the government's initial target of 4 to 5 million tons. According to data from Reuters and Egypt's Ministry of Agriculture, the shortfall stemmed from erratic weather conditions and rising production costs. Against that backdrop, the need to import grain has become even more urgent, yet Egypt no longer entrusts the entire food procurement process to its former agency, GAS. Since February 2025, this responsibility has shifted to a new unit named Mostakbal Mesr, a branch under the military tasked with ensuring food security during times of crisis. This shift in coordination mechanism has confused many international partners, especially US exporters who are accustomed to a more transparent system. Meanwhile, suppliers from France, Russia, and Canada have proven more flexible in payments, willing to accept terms like 180-day LCs, or deferred payments, something American businesses rarely accommodate. The turning point came in May 2025 when Egypt unexpectedly signed a contract to buy 180,000 tons of wheat from France, a clear signal that the country is diversifying sources to avoid dependence on any single nation. Among potential partners, Canada has started to emerge as a viable choice production, up 7% from last year, stable prices, on-time deliveries, and notably few political strings attached. No official cutoff announcement was made, but the numbers speak for themselves. According to Trading Economics, Egypt's grain imports in the first half of 2025 dropped more than 30% compared to the same period last year, down to roughly 4.9 million tons. Among that, US shipments fell sharply due to payment difficulties and high logistics costs. Egypt no longer has enough US dollars to regularly open letters of credit, and when faced with a choice between maintaining subsidized bread for its people or prioritizing trade ties with a superpower, the answer is not hard to guess. What does that mean for Americans? It means another once-friendly market is slipping away. The ships that used to leave Louisiana ports with American wheat no longer dock at Alexandria as frequently as before. The bagging plants that once printed US labels for the Egyptian market must now seek new buyers. And in major export states like Kansas, North Dakota, and Illinois, contracts, once deemed guaranteed orders, are now empty spaces on planning boards. This is not just a matter of trade, it is a rupture in trust. For years, the US played the role of food guarantor for many Middle Eastern countries, especially Egypt, the most populous in the region. When bread prices rose, the US offered aid. When grain was scarce, the US exported quickly. That relationship was more than commercial, it was political, sometimes even strategic. But now Egypt turns to sellers who don't lecture about democracy or attach conditions to aid, just clear paperwork and timely deliveries. On a street corner in Cairo, people queue for subsidized bread with food ration cards in hand. They don't care whether the loaf comes from Manitoba or Oklahoma. They care whether there's enough bread for the family today. And the Egyptian government, caught between the pressure of maintaining stability and a financial crisis, is choosing the lower risk path, one that America seems no longer able to manage. For American farmers, losing Egypt is not like losing a customer. It feels like being pushed off a chessboard they once commanded. In Midwest cooperatives, people are beginning to ask, if even Egypt doesn't need us, then who will? That question reflects not just fear of lost income, but the feeling of losing ground. They know why Canada is preferred cheaper prices, easier payment terms. But they also know what they cannot change. Input costs are out of their control. Fertilizer, fuel, transportation all rising while global markets squeeze the selling price. They don't blame Canada, they're just tired. And as former regular clients turn to other suppliers, American farmers can only quietly watch because they themselves are struggling just to feed their families. But the consequences of that rupture go beyond farmers or exporters. American consumers who might have expected to benefit from unsold goods are now beginning to feel the first shockwaves. When export doors close, many hoped the domestic market would be flooded with cheap wheat. But reality isn't that simple. In states like Kansas and Oklahoma, farmers are too disheartened to harvest what no one wants to buy. Some choose a bitter solution, burning their fields, plowing crops under to avoid further harvest and storage costs. In an industry where profits depend on every cent, keeping unsold goods can lose more money than abandoning them altogether. And the more troubling part, Egypt is redefining America's role in the global food equation. When a poor country that once relied on aid can now turn its back without explanation, that's a signal others are watching. The United Arab Emirates. In some places, the menu can change without a government resolution. Just one late shipment is enough. That's how the grain market in the UAE is revolving around the supply chain. With a population of over 11 million and more than 20 million tourists, annually wheat consumption demand in the UAE continues to rise. But whether it's a loaf of bread at a humble eatery in Sharjah or an expensive pizza in a Dubai hotel, the source of the flour is changing by the day, and the United States is gradually losing ground. According to the USDA FAS Grain and Feed Annual Report in Dubai, June 2025, the UAE is expected to import 1.98 million tons of wheat in the 2025-2026 season, a slight 2% increase from the previous year. The increase may seem small, but it shows the UAE remains one of the most dynamic markets in the Gulf region. In late 2024, the country imported about 95 million tons, of which Russia accounted for nearly half, $831,000 tons. Australia surged, and Canada has been quietly rising at a steady pace. The US was nearly absent, supplying only 10,000 to 30,000 tons, mostly for blending or to fill gaps when large contracts were disrupted. It's not that the UAE dislikes the US, they just no longer have sufficient reason to buy. US wheat averages $252 per ton, higher than Russia, $247, the EU $241, and even Canada about $256, but with stable logistics and quality. Shipping from the US across the Atlantic and through the Suez Canal isn't cheap, and it's far from reliable in a post-COVID world marked by conflict and climate change. Meanwhile, supplies from Europe, Turkey, or Canada are more accessible, require fewer conditions, and can quickly adapt to the UAE's delivery requirements. The UAE is not just a simple buyer. They are a country rewriting their food security strategy, not with promises, but with real money. The National Fund ADQ has bought shares in Limagrain, the world's fourth largest crop breeding group, and is quietly building its own supply chain. They don't need to grow wheat in the desert today, but they are laying the groundwork to do so by 2030. Investing in drought-resistant seeds is the UAE's way of buying time, and that sends a clear signal to traditional suppliers: don't assume today's position is forever. And these are not just short-term agricultural deals, this is a handshake about the future. The UAE isn't just buying wheat, they're buying autonomy, buying technology, buying self-sufficiency for years of water shortage and diminished trust. On the other hand, some major agricultural states in the US, like Texas or Arizona, which used to export to the UAE, are facing another obstacle: waves of instability in labor and immigration policy. As ice raids force many farm workers to leave the Southern Plains production stalls, not because of a lack of land, but because of a lack of labor. The UAE is watching these shifts. When a supply chain begins to smell of risk, even if only from domestic politics, buyers will look elsewhere. And that's when Canada appears as a more stable choice. For the US, this is no different than losing a market that seemed small, but was symbolically important. In its June 2025 report, the USDA noted that while total US wheat exports worldwide are expected to increase slightly, exports to the UAE are almost negligible. For many small and medium enterprises in Kansas, Idaho, or Texas, the UAE used to be a strategic gateway to the Middle East market. Now that door is almost closed, not with noise, not with a statement, just with the absence of orders. At US agriculture conferences, whispers have begun. If a wealthy, educated nation like the UAE a US ally that once proposed trade talks can turn away who will be next. The concern stems not only from export volume, but from a sense of lost soft influence. A supplier once seen as a standard is now considered slow, cumbersome, and expensive. In a market where speed and cost outweigh reputation, the US is being left behind, and farmers feel that clearly. In states like Kansas or Nebraska, where export contracts to the Middle East once brought joy, now there is only dismay. Many wheat growers have started cutting acreage or stopped planting altogether because storing the crop finds no buyer and selling it means a loss. Some domestic flour mills are adjusting capacity due to the lack of international orders to maintain output. The system from farm to factory to port has slowed, not due to supply shortage, but due to a shortage of buyers. Canada doesn't need to compete with words, they only need to be on time, priced right, and flexible. Gradually, they're taking over portions of the market that the US once assumed were theirs. In the eyes of the UAE, that stability is worth more than branding. Because when restaurant chains need ingredients on time, when storage depots need enough stock to stay on plane, they don't ask where the goods are from. They ask, is it on time? Is it the right price? Are there strings attached? This story doesn't stop with the UAE. It's like a small stone dropped into a still lake, creating ripples that no one knows where they'll end. And elsewhere, many other international contracts are being negotiated this time, without America's name in the final line. Jordan. Once US wheat held an irreplaceable position in Jordan's food supply chain. The bags labeled USA ID, Narfri Toftich, Tofturi of Pastiat. Not for sale were a familiar sight at subsidized bread distribution points in Amman. Since the 1990s, millions of tons of grain had been shipped under the PL 480 aid program, allowing the US to support an ally while maintaining soft power. For more than 2 decades, American farmers in Kansas, North Dakota, and Nebraska believed that every harvest season would see part of their crop cross the ocean to the Middle East, specifically to Jordan. It wasn't just exports, but a long-held belief that Jordan would always be there as a friendly, stable market. If you look at the history between the two countries, you'll understand that the bond wasn't merely transactional, it was built on habit, on mutual expectations. Americans grew, Jordanians consumed, and in between was a logistics chain built over years from Houston Port to Aqaba, from storage silos to each subsidized loaf of bread. But by 2025, those expectations began to slip out of sync. No clear announcement, no formal severance, just the absence of orders. Contracts once automatically renewed suddenly stopped. Price inquiry emails went unanswered, and then the USDA FAS June report confirmed US market share is disappearing in Jordan. What makes this shift hard to grasp is that it's silent but strategic. A clause in the CPOR agreement between Jordan and the UAE, activated in May 2025, allows Canadian wheat to move through Jebel Ali to Jordan with lower tariffs and significantly shorter transit time than the traditional route from the US. From a purely economic standpoint, Jordan did nothing wrong. With food inflation hitting 25% and strategic reserve demand rising 30%, they had no choice but to optimize every import dollar. Canada stepped into that gap with both finesse and certainty. The FTA between Jordan and Canada has existed since 2009, but never saw such active use as now. The CEPA with the UAE emerged as a logistical bridge, turning the UAE into the perfect transit hub for Canadian wheat. New packaging labeled Product of Canada is increasingly common in Amman supermarkets, quietly but meaningfully. In American farming states where Jordan was once considered a stable route, the disappointment stems less from immediate financial loss than from the disruption of a supply chain once thought durable. Milling plants in Kansas, Montana, and South Dakota that used to export regularly to Aqaba now have to scale back. Without steady volumes, the logistics network falters, shipping costs rise, and logistics companies lose a familiar destination. Jordan is not a large market in volume, but it used to play a strategic link role. Supply routes from the US through Jordan didn't just serve domestic consumption, they also transshipped goods to Syria, Lebanon, and northern Iraq. Losing Jordan means losing a foothold along a key corridor, a central station in the entire American logistics train in the region. Moreover, Jordan was where the US once piloted one of its most important strategies, converting aid into markets, from free aid to conditional sales, then eventually to stable commerce. Many trade experts called it the mature from aid model, and Jordan was the best example. Losing a market that had been invested in with trust mechanisms and resources is more a strategic blow than a numerical one. On a strategic level, this reflects a deeper change. Jordan used to exemplify America's provide agriculture to maintain influence model, but that only works when the US remains the best option. Now, when Canada offers more competitive pricing, faster routes, and almost no tariff barriers, the rationale for Jordan to stick with the US becomes thin. The Jordanian people didn't actively say goodbye. They just chose differently, practically like any consumer with the right to choose. And for American farmers, this presents a new reality. No market is fixed, even after decades of connection. A relationship that once felt solid, if not upgraded and nurtured, can fade in just a few seasons. It's not because the US did something wrong, it's just that the world around it changed. Smaller nations that once received aid can now negotiate, actively leveraging regional trade agreements for better deals. And if Jordan, a longtime customer deeply tied to the US supply chain, can walk away without a goodbye, then there's no guarantee the next names won't do the same. Qatar. Qatar didn't wait for US orders to be delayed before considering a shift. They acted one step ahead. While many Middle Eastern countries were still hesitating between choosing the US or Canada, Qatar quietly spent hundreds of millions of dollars to purchase wheat farms in Australia, invest in drought-resistant crops in Africa, and acquire shares in key links of the global food supply chain. They are not merely buyers, they are seeking to control the entire chain. In the early 2000s, Qatar consistently imported wheat from the US tens of thousands of tons each year, not a massive amount, but enough for the US to see it as a stable market. For a country with little arable land, Qatar once viewed the US as a reliable supplier. But then things changed. After the supply chain crisis in 2022 and the food price shock in 2023, they didn't wait for things to improve. They carved out a new path. Hassad Food, a Qatari state-owned agricultural investment group, wasn't looking for cheap prices. They aimed for long-term stability. Over $500 million was poured into Australian farmlands, seed research centers in Europe, and shipping ports in East Africa. In their latest annual report, the US was no longer mentioned. Instead, Canada appeared frequently not just for its high yield, but because they were willing to collaborate comprehensively from seed varieties, to credit from transportation, to contingency plans in volatile markets. While Saudi Arabia continues buying in large quantities, Egypt struggles with import policies the UAE chooses based on price, and Jordan takes advantage of tax incentives. Qatar has taken an entirely different route. They are building a whole food ecosystem with the supply firmly in their own hands. Canada was chosen not for being the cheapest, but for understanding the long game and for sharing control of the value chain. For American farmers, this is a tough pill to swallow. It's no longer about competing on price or shipping times. When the buyer becomes the producer, the role of the seller, if it doesn't evolve, will be left behind. Qatar isn't bargaining over the price of each shipment. They sign contracts for ownership of land and of seeds. For a country like the US, which once saw itself as the world's agricultural export center, this is a stark reminder. The question is no longer how can we sell more, it's does anyone still need us? As wealthy nations begin to grow, process, and store their own food, US agriculture, so reliant on exports, is facing a harsh reality. Canada, meanwhile, says little. But they show up on time. According to a June 2025 report from Canada's Ministry of Agriculture, Qatar has signed investment deals worth around $180 million with Alberta and Saskatchewan, not just to buy commodities, but to develop new seed strains, upgrade storage facilities, and improve logistics systems. Farmers in these regions now have access to preferential credit secure purchase contracts for at least 5 years and protection from global grain price shocks. This model allows Canada not only to guarantee domestic farmers' income, but also to take the driver's seat in the global market. And the US, once a leader, is gradually being pushed to the sidelines. For many American farmers, the feeling isn't exactly failure, it's being left behind. They look at silos full of wheat and barley, once symbols of national agricultural might, and no longer know who will buy them. They understand the world is shifting. Every nation wants control. But they also feel stuck in an outdated system, rising costs, shrinking support, and inflexible international trade. Meanwhile, Qatar has moved far ahead. They read news about Hassad Food and feel like guests who were once invited to the party but no longer make the list. Some had shipped to Qatar a decade ago. Now they can only watch as deals are signed with Canada, Australia, even African nations. The feeling isn't quite jealousy, it's emptiness, like standing still on the road while the rest of the world boards the high-speed train. And that's the scariest part, not losing a customer, but losing your voice. Because when others no longer need you to get what they want, you're left with only two choices: adapt or be replaced. Qatar, a small country with no land to grow wheat, has figured out how to rise. They don't just buy, they invest. They don't just import, they build their own supply chain. And while the world watches market prices fluctuate, they've quietly claimed the role the US once held. And now that Qatar has laid out such a clear path, what worries Americans most is this: it won't stop with just these 5 countries. Smaller markets once entirely dependent on imports are also quietly shifting. And if the US doesn't reinvent itself soon, the risk of being outpaced won't come from Canada alone. It will come from everywhere, from Brazil, from Russia, where new agricultural giants are rising every day. Looking back at the journey of these 5 Middle Eastern countries, one thing becomes clear: the world is quietly changing course. Each country is finding its own way to feed its people. Some choose Canada for price stability. Some change policy after just one meeting, and some go even further, investing across the globe to control supply at the root. Meanwhile, in America, farmers still walk across wheat fields as they have for years, only now no one is sure who will buy that wheat. Bread prices at grocery stores rise by the week. Family dinners now require budgeting every item. What do you think? Is there a way for American agriculture to regain its former place, or do we need to change ourselves first? Leave your thoughts below, because your voice might be exactly what many others are thinking too. This is not a video meant to divide or provoke. Everything shared here is based on real facts, reflections, and a desire to have a respectful conversation. We honor the U.S. Constitution and all federal regulations.